So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Richmond Art Gallery's Artist Salon series. This is the July 2020 session featuring our guest speaker today, Jairo Salazar. My name is Kathy Tycholis. I'm the Education Public Programs Coordinator for the Richmond Art Gallery. And I just wanted to welcome you all to the program again this month. And firstly, to acknowledge where we are, even though we're all Zooming from different locations all over the place. The Richmond Art Gallery is physically located on the traditional territories of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples. And we're very grateful to come from there today and to still be meeting all you there soon, hopefully, as well. For those of you who are new to the Salon program, it is a monthly program that happens the last Tuesday of each month. And we generally treat these as part professional development for artists, part inspirational talks for artists, and also just a way to really build up community with visual artists throughout the Lower Mainland, although it seems as we move online, we're starting to reach beyond our borders, which is really nice. So welcome to everybody that's joining us tonight. So tonight's talk comes from me really just having different conversations with different artists, and a lot of the conversations about, making art during these COVID times. So I thought it would be really interesting to get an art historical point of view. So bringing in someone like Jairo, who's got the art history knowledge, as well as talking about some contemporary artists and how they're sort of coping with these times. So I'll just read Jairo's biography for you so you know who he is. So Jairo earned his MA in art history from the University of North Texas in 2008. His background includes teaching and research experience in the fields of modern and contemporary art history in the United States, Colombia, and Canada. His academic research is devoted to exploring the dialogical intersections between war, catastrophe, and trauma reflected in contemporary art practices. Currently, he works as instructor for Coquitlam College and Mobil Art School and volunteers for the City of New Westminster Museum and Archives. So I just wanted to thank you, Jairo, for coming tonight. I will disappear into the background for your presentation, and I'll come back later on for the question and answer from our participants.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Melanie. And thanks to the Richmond Art Gallery for this great invitation. And thank you all for joining and participating in this unusual circumstance, but this is one of the positive outcomes of this coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic situation that we're all experiencing right now, no matter where you are in the world. I'm going to start sharing screen with you. There you go. And the title of my talk is pretty simple, Art in Times of Crisis. And as Kathy mentioned, I want to start by clarifying that I will try to give the perspective from my art historian background. I wish I could give you tools or advice for those artists joining and asking, what can we do right now? How can we cope with this situation? How can we survive as artists? I wish I had answers to all those questions. And in fact, we are in a time of uncertainty, in a time of high anxiety. So I just want to take an overview, a very quick overview. I wish I had more time, but it will take me a whole semester to go through all these ideas that came to my mind while preparing this talk. So without any further introduction, let's move on by asking a question. How come that an established artist who worked for the monarchy, such as Francisco Goya, ended up the same artist? We're talking about the same guy, creating monstrous, terrible scenes such as the disasters of war or the 3rd of May. Francisco Goya understood the need of the artist to separate creative processes from the interests of the establishment. The artist Goya served as a witness of reality and also as a denouncer of social injustice. He suddenly stopped portraying the monarchy and switched into depicting the commoners, the people, the victims, and not the victimizers became the subjects of Goya's compositions. For those of you who are not familiar with this painting, I will just try to give you a quick overview. On May the 2nd, 1808, there was an insurrection of Spanish rebels who rallied to stop the advance of Napoleonic troops who were trying to invade Spain. On the morning of May the 3rd, 1808, the French troops entered the houses of the rebels, took them as hostages out of their homes, lined them up to execute them in retaliation for their previous actions. Past, present, and future are all conveyed present in such a compelling fashion in this painting. The past, as you see here, those who already died. The future, those who know are going to be executed and are lining up, covering their faces in grief. And the present is this Christ-like figure in the center, illuminated only by this gas lamp and targeted by these soldiers who are lined up in this sort of a rhythmic repetition, armed with heavy artillery, warning us of the power of the new war machine. Mechanical, automatic, and soulless. The source of light is not the source of the enlightenment anymore. It's the light of death. It's not a light that is intended to illuminate purity or to serve as an allegory of beauty and enlightenment. That doesn't work anymore for Goya. The interminable present is the present of the guy with his hands in a cross-like position, with the stigmata in one of his hands, similar to the stigmata of the Christ from the scenes of the crucifixion. If you see closer in the painting, there is a kind of interesting anecdote that ties all together to this talk. At the lower left corner, you see sort of a scratch, like a mark, a damage in the painting that happened after it was transported in 1937 during the events of the Spanish Civil War. The canvas was severely affected. The Spanish Civil War happened around the 1930s, and Pablo Picasso denounced it with the famous artwork, the Guernica. How could a celebrated artist like Picasso respond to the atrocities of the Spanish Civil War? Was it his mission? In January 1937, Picasso was contacted by the organizers of the World Fair to be held in Paris from May to November of the same year. They asked whether Picasso could contribute with a new creation to be featured at the Spanish Pavilion. Picasso said yes, but he had no idea what to do. But in April 26, 1937, Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, in alliance with the Nazi German Luftwaffe and the Italian Condor Legion, allowed the aerial bombing of the town, killing about 70,000 innocent civilians and leaving the town completely destroyed and in flames. Picasso decided for this project to show the atrocities of the war and to show the bombing that happened on April the 26th. Guernica was a town in the Basque region of Spain who fiercely opposed the far right-wing politics of the general Franco. Franco thought that communism had to be wiped out of the surface of Spain. So that's why he decided, in alliance with the Germans and the Italians, to bomb the whole town. This is a great example of bringing the avant-garde, of bringing an artistic style out of the studio and into reality. Cubism into the everyday. The black and white served as allegorical symbols for destruction and the soullessness of the 20th century. The bullfighting as the spectacle of death, that very Spanish tradition of bullfighting, and the fragmented space, the deformity of the figures, and the visual revolution represented by Cubism acts in Guernica as a crude instrument to illustrate the fragmentation of the world. So Cubism is not fragmentary in theoretical terms anymore, in its plasticity. But now Cubism is also an allegory in symbolic language, showing us the broken mirror of reality as we knew it. Reality will not be the same anymore after the Spanish Civil War, but mainly after the events that happened in World War II. And of course, as you can see, the references, the influences of Francisco Goya in Picasso's work, in the sense of being an established artist who decided to take action, to take position, and set a precedent in relation to how he perceived politics. Now, did the Guernica have any effect in society? Maybe yes, maybe no. And maybe now it became sort of a landscape, kind of a commonplace. And that is telling us a lot about how in a saturated, hyper-connected era, such as the mid-20th centuries, maybe artists need to create works to cause another type of impact to this new consumer emerging society. So the first thing that artists and many intellectuals realized around the 1950s, 1960s, is that there has to be a convergence, a converging point between the political and the aesthetic. The aesthetic, as a behavior, liberates our mind and activates our senses. The aesthetic experience engages our senses, but the aesthetic experience cannot rely and should not depend upon reasoning. In fact, the aesthetic behavior ceases, stops, according to Kant and according to Jacques Rancière, when we provide scientific explanations to our innermost human pleasures. What are those innermost human pleasures? Well, we have the unconscious, our desires, our fears, our terrors, our dreams, and our fantasies. The modern aesthetic goes beyond any classical ideas on beauty, class, or good taste. And the modern aesthetic identifies with the uncanny and the everyday. So we will perceive from this point on in the conversation an arrangement of artworks that show a change of attitude from the artist. It sort of coincides with the spirit of the Parisian May of 1968, and also with some ideas stated by Joseph Beuys, the German-born artist, with this idea of the expanded field and the expanded art and the social sculpture. You know, change our attitude as artists. Let's go back to the basics. Let's go back to do something with our hands. That's the very basic definition of art. Let's take a posture, let's take a position in relation to the current political situation. Let's dematerialize the artwork. So the artwork becomes more an idea rather than a tangible commodity or object. And most importantly, let's use art to teach, to instruct as an educational, informative device that stops the alienation of society that has been immersed in um, in the society of a spectacle, to quote an idea coined by Guy Debord and the Situationists. Speaking of the consumer society, how can we call the attention of the consumer society? And one idea is through the use of expressive means that account for a wider reach in society. You know, popular means mass-produced, cheap not um, in the punitive sense, but cheap in the monetary sense, that they are affordable, temporary, catchy, flashy, scandalous, compelling. So we will see examples such as graffiti, tag art, fanzines, bombings, billboards, posters, or the famous détournement. Sorry, my French is terrible, but the détournement or the diversion proposed by the Situationists in the 1960s. The avant-garde is in crisis, modernity is in crisis. There is an exhaustion of languages of creation, modern languages of creation. And most importantly, the artist starts to feel that the interest of the process of creation, the interest of the artists is a genuine feeling that does not necessarily correspond with the market value. So the process, the creation comes here, the market value comes here, right? And they are not necessarily the same, because sometimes I hear people, students and friends and colleagues, they say, oh, contemporary art is such and such. Well, but it's not necessarily the contemporary artist, it's the contemporary market that makes such problem. Sometimes they both converge, but that's a different discussion, okay? In 1970, Cildo Meirelles, a Brazilian artist, produced this piece with the Coca-Cola bottles. When Meirelles produced the insertions into ideological circuits, Brazil was under military dictatorship, was facing a military dictatorship. The Coca-Cola project functioned as a perfect example of an artwork that was literally inserted in the everyday and that resonated with that political turmoil. Meirelles appropriated a symbol of mass production, the Coca-Cola bottle, and a symbol of consumer culture that responded to the expansionistic purposes and imperialistic demands of the United States. For the Coca-Cola project, Meirelles removed Coca-Cola bottles from normal circulation and modified them by slightly, subtly adding political statements. Yankees go home was one of the statements. Statements with critical undertone or instructions, as you can see in the middle, guiding the drinkers, the consumers of the liquid, to turn on how to turn the bottle into a Molotov cocktail. As the bottle emptied, the statements printed in white became translucent, became transparent. The message of the artwork functions only insofar as the bottles are refilled and returned for their mass-produced chain of production and circulation. The piece is devoid of any traditional interpretation regarding ideas tied to uniqueness. The bottles are mass-produced, so they are not unique. Originality. Coca-Cola is a pre-existing product. Technique. The bottles were not designed by Meirelles. Authorship. The bottles circulate as a commercial soda pop. Or ownership. You cannot own the bottles. You are supposed to return the bottles to the distributor. Grand Fury. Now that this week, I believe, is Pride Week, and I wanted to bring this subject because this is very important for the cause, was a collective advocated to the fight against those who ignored and discriminated issues driven by the spread of the HIV virus. Now we started talking about viruses. Grand Fury's name was a pun to the model of the vehicle used by the New York City Police Department, and using strategies that were happening at that time, the collective spread their compelling messages. The collective spread its compelling messages through the use of billboards, postcards, videos, posters, and paintings, such as the actions that you see here. The kissing doesn't kill, with an indifference that was placed on buses in New York City, and the silence equals death, which was a symbol that became universal in the fight for rights and acceptance for those victims of the HIV virus. The collective, their purpose, as one of their statement reads, was to raise public awareness by exploiting the power of art to end the AIDS crisis. Both projects here on display work to illustrate the role of art in propelling social change. This is the logo created, the silence equals death, by ACT-UP, and in coalition with Unleash Power and with Grand Fury, they projected the logo on the windows of the New York Museum of Contemporary Art. I apologize for the misspell here. Installation in the windows of the New York Museum of Contemporary Art in Broadway, New York City in 1987. And they displayed the image with another image correspondingly of a local politician who denied the numbers, who denied the actual numbers of people infected, victims, and dying of AIDS or having the HIV. Many of the actions performed by Grand Fury were a continuation of what Barbara Kroger, Material Group, or the Guerrilla Girls were doing around the same time period. Jenny Holzer as well is a name that just pops up in my head. So you probably have seen this Guerrilla Girls pop quiz. If February is Black History Month and March is Women's History Month, what happens the rest of the year? And the answer is discrimination. This is just one of many examples. And these were artifacts with a critical component that were introduced in the routinely environment disguised as billboards, street signs, fanzines, or objects of mass production. Grand Fury critically responded to the silence and implicit denial of the HIV crisis by local representatives and federal government. Silence implies complicity with the tragedy, and using mechanisms that resemble languages of publicity and advertisement, they however cannot be exactly read as advertisements. They cannot entirely be read as such, for they are not selling any goods or services. And in a Duchamp-esque turn of events, collectives such as Grand Fury used the system of production and the collective thought of the consumer society not to be a cohort or an accomplice, but they rather used it as a medium to spread a movement, an inconvenient but an urgent message to the general public. And you see on the right how people appropriated the cause by leaving that mark, the red blotted hand, stamped in some public places in New York City. The AIDS crisis was also approached by Cuban-American artist Felix Gonzalez Torres, who, by the way, passed away of AIDS in the year 1996. But he created this piece titled Untitled, the portrait of Ross. Now, you might wonder, who was Ross? The approximate 175 pounds of candy that make up the work resembled the weight, the actual weight, the body weight of Royce Laycock, the artist's boyfriend who died of AIDS in the year 1991. He uses sweet candy as an allegory of love. You know, we give chocolate boxes to our loved ones, and those boxes bring ideas of happiness, etc. The spectators take a piece of candy and by doing that become active participants of symbolically taking away pieces of Ross's body. In an ironic twist of events, the playful act of grabbing candy from the corner of the installation also suggests that we are acting like the virus, that we are taking small pieces of Ross away until there is nothing left. So the artwork is also temporary. You cannot own the artwork. You can only recreate it by placing more pieces of candy every time the artwork is going to be installed. So the spectators taking a piece of the work are also activating it. Eating the candy is also an act of love, an act of compassion. In a way, spectators are positively engaging with Felix and Ross's love story. They are consummating their love in the act of eating the candy or simply in the act of dignifying and collecting the pieces of candy to remind and to remember the life of Ross. Now, moving on to the case of an artist and a former colleague who engages with issues regarding the Mexican-American border crisis. The Sweet Bread of Life, quoting Cabrales, uses Mexican sweetbreads or pan dulce and blends dark satire and puns with the current views of border violence throughout the United States. I am quoting here Angel Cabrales. By involving the audience, the installation brings the issues of border violence and the enticement of the sweet life at the cost of one's life. End of quote. Angel does something brilliant as a Mexican-American artist, a third-born generation Mexican-American artist. He plays with the misuse of the adverb la instead of el by showing the intention of the artist in twisting the intricacies of the Spanish language, especially when it comes to the intertwined realities faced by immigrants, second or third generation, whose way of communicating is switching constantly from Spanish to English, or the other way around, a linguistic phenomenon known as Spanglish. With Cabrales, we cannot detach the presence of the sweetbread with the imagery of a gun. Cabrales' life experiences come from apparently opposite worlds, Mexico and the United States. However, they seem to share a commonality, an overwhelming culture and appetite for gun possession that evolves in urban and rural violence. The sweetbread is rooted in an innermost Mexican tradition, while the use of firearms has been both a means of defense against and of attack from the enemy. Cabrales subtly twists the mass-produced nature of the AR-15s the 9mm or the mini Uzis. Now, a pan dulce is neither mass-produced nor is its fabrication an easy task replaced by a mill or a warehouse or a factory. In Cabrales' work, there is no physical weapon. There is only the allusion to the weapon, right? The participants are mocking, such as in the picture that we see here, the placement of the bread as if it were a weapon targeting their mouths. It makes us wonder whether this collective trauma can still be seen as such, or if we are so used to it that it simply became a sort of everyday matter, commonplace. The explicit action, however, of eating the gun is interesting. We could say that one way to cope with traumatic events is by making fun, mocking, or laughing at them. Throughout history, art has effectively proved what comedian, television host, and I believe he's an activist as well, Jon Stewart cleverly stated once, I open quote, "If your regime is not strong enough to handle a joke, then you have no regime," end of quote. In other words, if humor and satire are means of teasing and destabilizing the structures of power, is because the foundations of those structures are not solid enough, as they proclaim. And if there is something that art history has taught me, I'm speaking here on a personal level, is that creativity is ignited, is propelled by tragic events. When artists, poets, writers, creators of any kind are under pressure, is when ideas flourish. I am not suggesting that you cannot create in times of prosperity. Of course you can. But for some reason, the human mind feels compelled to push the envelope when in times of crisis. And the title of the talk is Crisis in Singular. I should have wrote that in plural because we have currently a lot of crises. In Swinset Penitentiary, from the series Juegos Fronteras, and in Merry-Go-Round Port of Entry, Angel Cabrales presents us with a playground with wired fences and surveillance cameras. Similar scenes were visible during the first weeks of the lockdown as a result of the current COVID-19 pandemic, with tracking devices for contact tracing and the placement of long and shiny strips of yellow caution tape warning children and parents not to trespass to playgrounds to avoid contagion with the COVID-19 virus. Sometimes I wonder if Angel Cabrales' work foresaw what was coming, but it makes us wonder how will the parks and the playgrounds of the future post-pandemic will look like. Quote unquote, the most important decisions are made in the golf course. That's what you can read on Angel Cabrales' website when you find the A Hole-in-One project. Yet another example of playing with words. Hole-in-one, A Hole-in-One, A hole, I don't need to speak up the word. It's elusive to US President Donald Trump's decision to presumably host a G7 meeting at his golf club. The audience feels empowered by taking the role of the leader. They can play around by shooting what seems to be, you can see here in the picture, a wooden gun while comfortably sitting on an easy chair. Instead of targeting at birdies or usual greens, participants are invited to target at green-shaped light countries. Now, they take position. They sit in either the red or the blue map of the United States of America, depending on your political party. So Angel is suggesting that there are two Americas, the Republican America and the conservative, the Republican America or the Democrat America. There is a twist to the story, though. The flags and greens correspond to countries, as you can see here with the flag of Mexico. The President of the United States has threatened through Twitter by implying he will start a conflict with them. So you can find Mexico, Venezuela, I believe Iran, North Korea, and so on. The chair is important, and you see here, as a throne or a pedestal encompasses a symbol of authoritarianism. Chairs, thrones, men in horses have also worked as allegories of dominance and control. It was believed during the previous history of art that if an emperor could control his horse, he could easily control all his troops and therefore a whole empire. He could dominate the rest of the world. That's why it's important to remember the bold gesture of African-American artist Kehinde Wiley, who in 2005 portrayed American rapper Ice-T, sitting on the same throne as a direct reference to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' depiction of French Emperor Napoleon. Wiley's is a gesture of defiance, justice, rebellion, but mostly a type of rebellion that is not violent, is dignifying, and is reclaiming, or rather claiming, for denied rights. In some interviews, Wiley acknowledged his disappointment in art school when he could not find any artworks created by or featuring a Black person, unless it was portrayed as a servant, as a slave, as a Moorish boy, or as a criminal, as a thug. That experience made Wiley reconsider his role as an artist in rethinking the hierarchical narratives throughout the history of art. Ice-T does not look authoritarian. Neither is his gesture, neither in his gesture nor in the clothes he wears. He's not even facing the spectator directly at the eyes. He's gazing kind of in a disinterested manner, as opposed to Napoleon, who is sort of like threatening you with his gaze. Ice-T is portrayed as a regular civilian without any intention of conveying or demonstrating power and authority. And in a similar way as we saw in Cabrales' work, what Ice-T is implying with his pose and lack of royal garments is that any of us could eventually take the throne and sit in the place where oppression and imperial power was practiced for centuries. Such gesture of reclamation came into the minds of American pop culture and the minds of many young people when celebrated hip-hop artist Kendrick Lamar climbed on top of a police car in 2005 during a performance at the BET Music Awards. Lamar's performative gesture in the realm of pop culture and mainstream music is important because he's questioning practices that today are of common knowledge. Tyrannical authoritarianism, police brutality, and social inequality. Stepping on top of the police car epitomizes the feeling of many African Americans. In this context, the police car is the pedestal symbolizing the official authority imposing power and control over a prosecuted, defenseless, and historically segregated group of population. what happens when collective feelings towards questionable actions performed by the police or the military are censored? On October 2019, a collective in Bogota known as Pure Poison, Puro Veneno Collective, I don't know how to translate it, Pure Poison, I guess, along with an organization of families victims of false positives, created a public mural denouncing the action of 5 officials of the Colombian military who, according to the sources, were not only accomplices, but also leaders of the despicable practice of counting the deaths of innocent civilians as false positives, members of guerrilla or paramilitary forces killed in combat. The mural with the faces of those involved was titled, "Who Gave the Order?" in allusion to the fact that many of those implicated officials claimed that they were simply following orders, and therefore they were trying to declare themselves as innocent. We can see the stencil faces of high Colombian military officers and the statistics of people killed under the false positives politics. The graffiti was part of the Campaña por la Verdad initiative, hashtag Campaña por la Verdad initiative, led by 11 human rights organizations. The case was denounced 14 years ago, but came back again in 2019 after a report published by the New York Times denouncing a continuation of this practice by the military in order to show successful results to the government in their fight against subversive and mafia groups. As you can see in the picture, the mural was censored, was painted over with white paint during an early morning by 2 or 3 young soldiers and some other assistants that were sent by the military to cover the mural. The act of censorship stirred so much controversy amongst many civilians and the general public that the collective, the Organization of Mothers of Sons, Victims of False Positives, and the 11 organizations for human rights started spreading the render for the mural on social media. The image became viral worldwide after a few days, and today is still used in public protests as a live reminder of injustice and official abuse. The mural became posters, billboards, t-shirts, flags, internet memes, backgrounds, etc. The message, with the power of social media, remained alive. A similar case happened a few months before. In September of the same year, artist Lucas Ospina and a woman artist named Power Paola portrayed an important leader as a puppeteer manipulating another important leader who likewise was manipulating another important leader. I don't need to say the names. The day after the mural was made, the mural was covered with white paint. The mural became a sort of palimpsest after the event. The artists and other volunteers started recreating the mural. And this is before COVID-19, of course. It became a place of public gatherings, collective participations, conversations, and even public college classes, held on the spot, in situ. So college classes were happening there in a campaign known as Classes at the Mural, something like that, I can't recall. Clase a la calle, classes to the streets. That will be kind of like the translation. This is how the mural looked like. This is how the mural looked like after covered. And this is how the mural kind of looked like after all the many recreations, even with some uh, Spanglish, causing language. But anyway, mm, I am a very stable genius was the first prick, the first needlework created by Diana Weimar, a Canadian artist born in Victoria, British Columbia. She created this in January 2018. The project began in 2018 as a response to Donald Trump's tweets. Diana Weimar felt so overwhelmed by the fact that the commander-in-chief of the United States was massively spreading that information through the elusiveness, the oblivion, and the benefit of anonymity, even though he's not anonymous, that characterizes social media, that she decided to respond by stitching prick by prick the words of the president. Of course, the Tiny Pricks project also is a play with words, you know, it's sort of a pun with the prick. The prick is prick by prick, the stitch by stitch, but also prick as the derogatory term in a way implying that the president of the United States is also that word, okay? She shared the project, the first prick, through social media, and the responses were remarkable. And that's how Tiny Pricks project began. Diana decided then to make this as a solid, constant project, asking anybody, you could join if you want, you could participate, who wants to contribute by submitting a picture of their pricks. She uses Instagram to post on a daily basis the pricks sent by volunteers, and the pricks and embroideries have taken the shape of kilts, handkerchiefs, rally caps, dishcloths, lampcloths, etc. And here you can see some samples. Even the project took another dimension when COVID-19 started. And of course, most of the pricks that are being produced right now with an international undertone have taken position regarding what politicians are doing all over the world in relation to the action and to the reaction about COVID-19. In a way, Weimar's intention was to make permanent, and is still to make permanent records of something that was supposed to be elusive. How many times do we read tweets and the day after we forget about them? And she said, no, we have to remember by stitching word by word, sentence by sentence. Weimar's project acts as a device of memory, as a reminder of a time of crisis, of a global catastrophe, and also acts in this very traditional manner of stitching, acts as a pedagogical tool for future generations, as in the old, the old-fashioned kilts stitched by grandmas and mothers all over the world. Weimar's project, as if it were a diary of horror, reminiscent of the war diaries of Bertolt Brecht. I don't know if you're familiar with War Primer by Bertolt Brecht, or Anna Frank, subtly but fiercely states, never again. Here we see a couple more examples. I shook hands with everybody. That was a quote by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. On the right, we see a collaboration by a fellow Canadian, Alex Simpson, Please America, Not Again, manipulating the famous Make America Great Again rally cap by Donald Trump. And of course, one of the Donald Trump ties, attached to it. Tiny Bricks is expecting to complete in 2020 bricks by the end of the year, corresponding with the year in which we are right now. Their long-term goal is to keep producing daily bricks until the end of Trump's presidency. And this is a terrifying tweet, by the way, that motivated the work of Huckabee Studios. And this is just a quick commentary because we're also kind of running out of time and we still have some images to discuss. They created this mural in downtown Fort Worth, Texas, between two historical monuments, Martin Luther King Monument and a John F. Kennedy Monument in downtown Fort Worth on Tuesday, June the 30th, 2020, as a response to the assassination, the infamous assassination of George Floyd, which has reactivated the causes of the Black Lives Matter movement. They got 250 volunteers. So this is also speaking of another example of a collaborative project. The artists are sort of like letting their egos go. And this is how the mural looks like. It says, "End racism now." The word racism painted in black. Each volunteer signed up with their names on the white paint, on the white sections of the mural, and now are in white. So that's pretty symbolic in the sense of racial causes, and racism is painted in black. So the act of writing the names on the white paint also speaks of this idea of, hey, respect me, I am present, I am a human being, and racism now. It reminds me of Doris Salcedo's action, adding absences or sumando ausencias, that happened in 2016 in Bogota as a response to a popular vote that turned out to be against the peace treaties with the oldest guerrilla in the world, the FARC. And many people were moved about this, and they wanted to remember fallen victims of violence, terrorism, and also the disappeared. So it was a way of monumentalizing the pain with a collective action. But it's also an action of grief, an action of remembrance, an act of collaboration. And also it reminds me of the work of Diana Weimar and the project with Tiny Bricks, because Doris Salcedo asked volunteers to stitch the pieces of cloth one by one to make all together this huge, kind of like a canvas with names of victims of violence or disappeared. There is an act of remembering and also a ritualistic therapy for grieving in stitching, in the act of stitching and in the act of creating manual labor for this monumental piece. And there is I read on the news that the mother of a disappeared civilian found the name of her son in one of the kilts, and her reaction was so moving, and she started yelling and screaming in a very emotional state, "That's the name of my son, that's the name of my son." So the volunteers who were stitching that section or that piece called her to collaborate, and she finished stitching that symbolic piece that in a way was the tomb of her son. She was saying goodbye to him in a way, in a symbolic way, because there is no body to grieve, there is no body to bury or to burn. And finally, before we go, we only have 5 minutes left, but it's perfect timing. You know that I collaborate with a Mobil Art School. That's the institution that um, sort of helped to or contacted me to deliver and to facilitate this talk. And Mobil Art School is a project that began in 2019 in Vancouver, and is organized by, um, I believe, a group of 3 or 4 artists are the leaders of the project. And the name mobile has this connotation of mobility. So moving from one place to the other is not static, it's not in one place. So we offer remote courses or talks such as this one to other places and even non-traditional places. I have delivered talks in the past to retirement homes, speaking to the elderly about art. And you will expect, well, maybe the elderly are not interested in art. Well, they are, and they are very interested, and they were super, super, extremely engaged with the topics. Of course, that changed a little bit after COVID, but even before COVID, the staff of Mobil Art School was working on a project to revolutionize the ways we understand artistic collaborations. And this has to do with this current time, so that's why I wanted to bring it to you. So they created an app that is called EQ, the game, and EQ appropriated the language of data and surrealism because they, the data and the surrealists in that context, that turmoil and context of the war in the 20th century, perfectly knew the importance of defying rational systems of thought. In the data and surrealist logic, if reason and technology brought as a result the worst wars known in human history, World War I and World War II, then reason is as mad and as destructive as the illogical, irrational, romantic mind that the project of the Enlightenment and the new regime were trying to introduce. Max Ernst, the German artist, used to say, I quote him, that all good ideas in life arrive by chance, end of quote. In a world where everything that seemed to be reasonable and true is vanishing and collapsing to the floor, in a world where our granted realities are conflicting nowadays, the process of chance achieves a renewed importance. Randomness for Mobil Art School unlocks the flow of our imagination and brings us back to that childhood state of innocence, spontaneity, and naive, disinterested creation. EQ appropriated the language of the exquisite corpse. The exquisite corpse, for those who are not familiar with the term, for those who never created exquisite corpses in elementary school, consists of a collaborative composition made of separate sections created arbitrarily with no order and later rearranged to recreate the unconscious intricacies of the human mind. Now, why is this different and how is this relevant to our discussion today? Well, the project removes the physical limitations of the traditional means of creating art. You don't have to worry for a page. You don't have to worry for paper size. You don't have to worry for drawing or painting tools or materials. You don't have to worry for geographic locations anymore. You don't have to worry for your audience or a limited reach for collaboration. In one of the founders' words, I open quote, the app enables people of all walks of life and ages to collaborate and make unexpected creative connections. The resulting art is communal and blurs the boundaries of authorship. End of quote. Since their foundation, this is before COVID, the concept of mobility, intended to step out of the limited access and exclusive spaces of art schools, colleges, and universities to immerse into decentralized ways of creating through experimental programming and technology. And this webinar is a proof of that. Just to give you a quick example. With EQ, you may find that you have creative connections with someone of completely different views than your own. And the goal they have, I don't know if you understood, but here, so I cannot draw on the board, but if you see here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe 5 different collaborations. And this is the final result on the right. So the one on the top left is different from the one in the middle, and is different from, I don't know, the one on the right and the one below. And here are more examples of those results. So you submit your contribution, and the AI, or the artificial intelligence of the platform, sort of rearranges it by chance. And this is what happens at the end. Of course, there is a main topic that you are supposed to respond to. So draw a building, I don't know, draw a skyscraper, draw a face, I don't know. And the final result is something completely unexpected. Their goal is to be the Guinness record for the longest Exquisite Corpse project to kick off the event. Currently, the app is in beta mode, but you can download it by going to any of these 2 links here. Maybe I can copy, or Kathy can copy them on the chat later, or share them through social media. I don't know how we can work that. The goal is to be the Guinness records for the longest Exquisite Corpse project. That's pretty amazing. And Mobil plans to be available in the App Store by the end of September, at which point anyone in the world could download the app through the store. Okay, so you can download it directly from the website, or by visiting this link right here. And I just wanted to take 1 more minute just to show you something that is happening in Bogota currently. This is actually from today. I just found out about this today. The museum of the bank, the official bank of Colombia, the Banco de la República, is creating a collaborative project titled Interior-Exterior: Artistic Exchanges in Times of Pandemics. So this is the proposal of Kinaya Kumer. Take sunbaths, the art of sunbathing in quarantine, tomen baños de sol. So the idea is to use your apartment as a display window, as an exhibition space, and people outside, either by taking photographs or just passersby, can experience the artwork. So that's just one contribution. And this is the one that I found hilarious. I thought art would save me, but it hasn't. And I actually wish you had said something to me that day, by Carmenza Banguera. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you all enjoyed the talk. You can reach me at my email, and here's my LinkedIn in case you want to reach me sometimes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jairo. We already have 1 question, so I thought let's just jump right into the questions.
All right.
So what art do you find to have the most volatile reactions, as in not only destroying the art, but also attacking, arresting, or harmful things happening to the artist? And I will add to, sorry, I was just going to add to that, because someone else made a comment while you were talking about the murals that had been defaced.
Okay.
And someone wrote in that there was a peaceful authorized installation in Victoria recently about Black Lives Matter, with memorials to all Canadians killed by police, and it was ripped apart in less than 24 hours.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
No,
that's really, yeah, that's really important to know, because the other day, as part of my volunteering duties, I was speaking to my coordinator, and I was actually talking about that. And I was wondering, it will be interesting to see of cases of public art that has been destroyed or covered on or defaced. I did know about the defacings of um, some statues in Chinatown, and that is constantly happening every here and there. And apparently, it is during the summertime. I believe in the summer is when people get more energy and they go out and they do these things. Um, but going back to the question, any it reminds me of Jon Stewart's quote in a way. I mean, any type of humor, any type of satire, any type of joke that becomes inconvenient to the establishment causes the worst reactions. And either in a political sense or in a devotional, religious sense, you get the strongest reactions for those who want to maintain a type of discourse that at the end of the day is pretty fragile. Because why would you feel threatened by that? Why would you feel attacked if it's not, those movements or those causes are not necessarily telling you, join us, um, there was a controversy in Colombia a few years back because um, some politicians were claiming that by talking about homosexuality in elementary schools or in high schools, everybody will become homosexual. And how they sort of like instrumentalize families like that. And it's pretty frightening to think that way, because it's like we need to have that conversation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, it's not like a sound wave that is going to turn you into, you know and and also in the same art world, there is some type of sectarism sometimes. So even artists who are not necessarily questioning the status quo, but are just trying to make something different, are attacked. And the history of art is full of stories like that. People tend to forget that Impressionism was, was like throwing a bomb on the street back in the days. Impressionism was not accepted back in the days. So there was also this discussion on style and then discussion on moral values and whatnot. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, I think a lot of it is the polarizing effect of politics these days, where it's not a matter of, it's becoming like you're saying something to try to convert me as opposed to having a discussion.
Exactly.
There's no more debate, unfortunately, which leads to another question from someone. Is trauma creating a rupture in contemporary art? Are we moving away from indeterminism and ambivalence in postmodern art?
Wow, that's a tough question.
Mm-hmm.
I will again. I will use a quote to answer that question. It reminds me of Paul Virilio in The Accident of Art. Paul Virilio said, "The day contemporary art recognizes itself as a casualty of war, we can start talking again." Through human history, I believe that just the act of expressing something, the necessity of expressing or visualizing something in a material or in a conceptual way, responds to a trauma. Just the act of living sometimes, I'm pretty Friedrich Nietzsche type of guy in that sense, that just the act of living constitutes by itself a struggle. Not knowing where you are or what you are supposed to do. But when it comes to postmodernity, you know, postmodernity opened the scope, the dream of globalization and the world as a global village, and we are all a community, and we are all the same, and that dream came into ashes after 9/11. But I wouldn't want to suggest that 9/11 was the end of globalization as we know it. The final, the final word on globalization, the expiration date of globalization was COVID-19. Because COVID-19 disengages everything that globalization was supposed to mean. Traveling freely all over the world, going to places anytime you want it. So we are becoming more protective now than what we were in the past, or at least in the last 30 years. So the dream of postmodernism is over for sure. And I figure that after in the post-pandemic time, whenever that happens, there will certainly be a significant shift in interests and in outcomes from institutions, from galleries, from artists. How, I still don't know. But for instance, I want to say, and I probably am wrong, that artists will necessarily start thinking more in collaborative terms and not in a way of, I am this person and I want to sell my work because my work matters. I don't think that's going to happen anymore, at least with emerging artists. With established artists, that's a different conversation. Christie's had a record sale a couple of weeks ago, incredible, during COVID times, and they sold a significant amount of artworks by, I don't remember if it was by Barnett Newman, but anyway, there were a couple significant names there, but that's a different story. I'm speaking here of, emerging artists. Collaboration is the key.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And just thinking about, you've shown so many different ways that artists have responded throughout the years, which is related to Mohammed's question. Mohammed from Mobil, who's saying thank you for mentioning the app, by the way.
Oh, my pleasure. It's awesome. I love it.
So his question is there a particular trait or skill or a way of looking at the world that we can learn from the artists you discussed otherwise? You did mention collaboration as one, but are there other connections there?
Okay. There are so many ways to answer that question. One is being noisy. I always insist on the idea of being noisy. Make noise, be brave. Be brave, oh my God, there are so many examples that I had to take out of the conversation, but I didn't know if you knew that Andy Warhol suffered from a condition. So he had a kind of like a skin condition similar to what Michael Jackson had. So he had to remain in isolation, in self-confinement, like quarantined for months. I mean, I'm not speaking weeks here, like months and months and months. And that's how he came into contact with popular culture. And his family was so poor that they were eating, they were, I believe, Polish immigrants. So they were eating canned soup. So he was eating Campbell's soup and, and surviving out of that. And based on that personal experience, that he became fascinated with the consumer culture of America. Henri Matisse was bedridden when he was in his late 50s, I believe, and the guy couldn't move anymore. And it's Henri Matisse. I mean, imagine one of the most important artists in history and the guy cannot move anymore. I mean, not in history, at least in Western art, you know. And he says, you know what? I'm going to start creating cutouts from my bed. And that's how he created jazz. So resilience, bravery, determination. I think that most of the examples that we saw today are of people who were stubborn. Francisco Goya was, uh, uh, you know, the more I learn about him, the more he surprises me. Yes, he had some issues, but I'm speaking here artistically. Getting out of the comfort zone and saying, you know what, this is how this is going to work. And back then, I mean, you didn't have grants, or you didn't have support from institutions and all that. So it was a gamble. Many of them passed away with nothing. And that's when the art market comes, but that's a different conversation. But today, the results of Material Group and Grand Fury and, you know, the Guerrilla Girls, there are things that resonate, and every here and there they come back. Black Lives Matter wouldn't exist if it weren't for all those movements that happened in the 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s that showed a possibility, you know, for future generations to say, you know what, when we don't like something, let's stand up and fight the power, as the song says.
And that connects to another question from Andre. Do you think is it possible this situation, I'm assuming COVID, could start a new art movement where massive collaborations could be the basis?
I think it's already happening. The issue is that we cannot judge our own time, right? So we are, you know, you can only judge time after it passes. When you are living it, it's really hard to take a position and to judge. We can talk about the early 2000s because it's been 20 years, so we kind of realized what was going on. But to judge COVID is still too early. But the social collaborations that happen through these new platforms, they are changing the rules of the game, I tell you. I was even discussing with some colleagues the other day in regards to my duties as a college instructor. And I know this sounds like like a like an advertisement, but Zoom changed the rules of the game for many things. So I was telling my students the other day, you know, 10 years ago, this wouldn't be possible. There weren't platforms to have webinars or events with, I don't know, 32, 33 people connected at the same time from anywhere in the world. So this type of technologies absolutely change the rules of the game. But it's too early. You know, I see the collaborations by some musicians and I find that hilarious. I mean, it's still a pretty early stage of, so the Rolling Stones playing from the apartment, and it looks kind of dorky. And sometimes it looks terrible too. Like they, you know, they don't sound well, but it's just one step towards something bigger. Maybe I sound too optimistic. I know there will be extremely big challenges for small galleries, for institutions that rely on funding, public or private. But again, you know, I look back and I'm like, artists survived wars. They have survived pandemics as well. We didn't talk about artworks depicting pandemics, but there are plenty. So I'm pretty sure that we will get over this for sure, and we will be stronger for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think it's, you know, like you said, with Zoom impacting things, and also things, and like you and I have talked in the past, like things like Instagram, you showing that artist who's created a whole new community that most likely she would not have been able to reach out to that extent.
That's a great example. Her project was a personal project. Mm-hmm. She was just using the breaks as sort of like a diary type of thing. And then she decided to post that online, and look what she created. She pretty much lost control of it. I mean, it's not her project anymore. She was just the initiator of something that became a global phenomenon from anywhere in the world. I mean, people are sending stuff from everywhere. There are on the Instagram, there are some examples from Brazil with Bolsonaro. And I mean, it's pretty moving to see people engaged in such a compelling fashion for the same cause.
Mm-hmm. Another question. As I've learned from our history, movements like Impressionism, Expressionism, etc., where you can a lot of this work was categorized. And Joselito, mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misreading your question, but it's, would you say this movement is just more following the social political condition of the times, or would you sort of classify this as a new art movement?
Okay, so that is a great question, by the way, because speaking of postmodernity and speaking of contemporaneity, categorizing is a traditional way of trying to organize a current trend. And I mean, that opens a whole different conversation, but with the wide amount with the overwhelming flow of information, and with the open access that we have today to so many things, with the internet and all that, it's impossible to categorize a kind of work or a group of proposals and projects that are happening everywhere in the world. You can call it social activism. You can categorize it any way you want, but I don't see if that serves any purpose. Categories were a means of organizing collective ways of thinking. But after the 1970s or after the 1980s, there were so many categories for art collectives and movements or styles and things like that, that there was no way to keep track of it anymore. Also because the sources of information are different anytime, you know what I mean? I wouldn't really worry too much in trying to categorize what is happening today. Maybe in the future, but at least not today. I always joke in the sense that every period in history produces the type of art that corresponds to its imaginaries. So if Michelangelo, if Leonardo da Vinci had lived in the 21st century, they will be completely different artists because they had access to other type of information. Back then, they didn't have television, they didn't have photography, they didn't have film, they didn't have magazines, they didn't have internet. So pretending to create the same type of art today that was created during the Renaissance, to me, is kind of anachronic. You can do it, that's perfectly fine, but there are more tools at your disposal that you can make use of, such as the internet,
Mm-hmm. It just reminds me of a random interview I saw with the actor Jim Carrey, mm-hmm. who is now an artist as well. Who puts all his artwork, his drawings out on Twitter, and he refuses to use Facebook or Instagram because because of Zuckerberg. But he will only use Twitter, and his philosophy is it's just another artistic tool, as
Yeah,
as opposed to seeing these things as for something else.
right.
It is just another tool in your toolkit as an artist, and I find that a really interesting way of looking at it.
Absolutely. Every time I become more keen of Joseph Beuys's way of thinking, when Joseph Beuys said, every human is an artist. And that reminds me of, Marcel Duchamp's bicycle wheel, or the famous fountain, the urinary. And the reflection, particularly connecting it with today's talk, is, if we keep asking what is art and what is not, we're losing such a great opportunity of creating new things, different things. And when Joseph Beuys says every human is an artist, he's kind of agreeing with Duchamp in that the process of creation of any type of human experience is as complex as any masterpiece in the history of art. In other words, if you think about it, the guy, to use the example of the bicycle wheel, the guy who once said, you know what, I want to create something that you sit on, and then you start moving your legs and you transport from the place to the other. The creative thinking to produce something like that is as amazing as the creative thinking of somebody like Leonardo da Vinci when painting the Mona Lisa. It's as simple as that. What is the difference? The difference is that the bicycle serves a utilitarian functional purpose, and the Mona Lisa is intended to be placed in a frame and hung on a wall and persevere through history. But the creative process is as complex as, making a chair, or doing your breakfast, or whatever, Anyway, I just ramble with my thoughts. But
Well, we have no more questions other than, will there be a part 2? Maybe
I
we
would
need
love to. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe we need to continue and talk, like you mentioned, all the artists. You didn't mention that dealt with viruses and illness in the past. I mean, that might be a
Yeah.
whole other topic we could touch on for sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because absolutely, because that's another type of crisis or another type of challenge. And that's a condition, a health condition that instead of stopping artists from producing work, was a sort of a game changer. Okay, I'm not going to do this anymore, but this is inspiring me to create this other thing. So yeah, the questions were great. It was a great outcome.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again, Jairo, for the great talk. A lot of feedback just on the chat saying thank you very much. So people obviously really enjoyed the talk.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you everyone who participated tonight and watched us. Come back next month. Maybe we'll have part 2 for next month.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, well, we'll book you in next month. We'll do part 2. So thank you again, everyone. And I will be posting the link for the mobile app. When we post this as a video to our YouTube channel, I'll include all that info. And if there's any other links that you wanted me to include, I can include that as well for everybody.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Thank you, everybody, and good night.